Good. Happy to have you on the show here. So, we've got important news to talk about if I could find the right tab. I have your very important piece here, the last one you wrote for the American Conservative. This time it's different. It's about how we've essentially had our soldiers and Marines patrolling Pashtuns and Paktika for the last 20 years, and seemingly, the likes of Biden think that that's what war is like. Those have been absolutely horrible for the Iraqis, the Afghans, and the Americans fighting them too. But this is altogether a different type of war, and it is so far removed, it's 7,000 miles from America's easternmost point. We're still very far removed from it, and I think the reality of the war has not really sunk into the American people or even to the American leadership other than in talking point format that looks how cruel the Russians are, which there's some truth to that. But this is a total war going on over there in East Ukraine right now, huh? Well, the other thing is the potential for this thing to widen and ultimately draw us in, thanks to this administration, is enormous. Yeah, and if we're drawn into this conflict, in any way, whether it is just on the high-end conventional side or God forbid worse and escalates to the nuclear level, it will be devastating for us. Americans need to understand that this will be unlike anything they've experienced because, frankly, those other wars that you mentioned were in the realm of colonial conflicts. What we normally refer to as low-intensity conflict, it's not the best label because if you're being shot at, there's nothing low-intensity about it. Nevertheless, it's a huge difference. And the tens of thousands of casualties, tens of thousands dead, should frighten Americans. Right now, they're not paying that much attention, and they could easily be drawn into this by the Biden administration. Now, for the war in the East itself, what could you compare it to in recent history? Maybe the Iran-Iraq War, something like that. Well, if you imagine going back to Vietnam, we lost 58,000 men killed over the space of nearly 10 years. Within the last 12 months, we now estimate that close to 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed, and there are 300,000 to 400,000 Ukrainian casualties, with more than half of those casualties involving injuries so severe these men will never return to duty. Then you have to look at the Russian side. We estimate now 70,000 to 80,000 casualties and 20,000 to 25,000 dead. The reason they're so disproportionate is that 75% of the losses on the Ukrainian side involve losses to artillery, missiles, rockets, drones, in other words, standoff attack weapons. The Russians outnumber those weapons that the Ukrainians have by 10 to 1, so tens of thousands of artillery rounds are falling on human beings virtually every day across eastern Ukraine. It's no wonder that the southern Ukrainian defense is crumbling, and their casualties are mounting, and they have no way to stay there with any certainty and survive. So, I think you're going to see a massive exodus north and west out of the Donbass, which of course is what the Russians want. But until Zelensky gives the order, thousands more will die needlessly in places like Bakhmut or Khan or any number of different places. All right, now they do have the home field advantage. They've got American weapons. We're a year into this war, and they have held the Russians, not just in the Donbass, but the eastern part of the Donbass. There, the lines obviously are somewhat fluid, but the Russians aren't occupying too much more territory than the pro-Russian rebels were before the war broke out at this point, right? Well, other than, I guess I should say, the land bridge in the south to Crimea, of course. There, the Russians occupy 22 to 23% of the country. They're sitting on top of all the nation's industry and, frankly, 90+% of its gross domestic product. In other words, everything that produces income for Ukraine that's of any real significance is currently under Russian control. That's not really surprising because most of the people that lived there to begin with are Russians, and historically it was Russian, and that really is the only area that Putin was really interested in liberating from Ukrainian occupation and oppression. But I think we need to understand something. When the Russians went in to begin with, they went in with a relatively small force on the assumption that demonstrating the seriousness with which they took what happened in Ukraine, their legitimate security interests, that we would respond with negotiations. And it took a few months for the Russians to finally discover, well, the Americans are not only disinterested in negotiating, the Americans see this as an opportunity to fatally harm Russia. So, the Russians went back, re-examined their options, and decided that they had to go to war. And it's taken them several months to prepare for what you call total war. I wouldn't go that far. I would just say high-end conventional war. And now they have hundreds of thousands of troops in Russia, in western Russia, and in southern Ukraine, and I think they're ready for it. The problem is that the winter was short. They only had about 2 or 3 weeks of frozen ground, which would have facilitated some maneuver. But it wasn't enough time in the estimation of the Russian high command to support major offensives that they want to succeed. So, they held back, and what we see now is the mud season. We have vehicles. I get videos all the time from all sides showing me trucks and armored fighting vehicles mired in 6, 7 feet of mud that they can't get out of. So, for the moment, at any rate, the Ukrainians are being helped by the fact that there's no mobility, and the Russians can pursue them to a limited extent, but not to the extent they could if it were dry. Now, this mud is going to dry out, but it will probably take most of March and April for that to happen, which means we won't see the massive movement of forces until May and June. When that occurs, I think they'll rapidly sweep over eastern Ukraine, and I suspect they will then probably cross the Dnipro and start moving west. Because one of their goals is to cut off the Polish border from Kiev and cut off Ukraine and its army from any further assistance from us. Now, how difficult is it from here to keep track of how many brigades and divisions and this and that are left on those positions on this and that side? Well, on the Ukrainian side, they're right now in eastern Ukraine. We estimate there are 16 brigades. Most of those are at 60 or 50 or 40% strength. And if you do the math and you start out with 4,000 in a brigade and you cut that manpower in half, you have an appreciation for the losses, which have been horrific, and they're starting to feed new recruits into the system. I sent you earlier a lengthy comment from people on the ground in Ukraine who are watching the Ukrainians bring in these new recruits. These are overwhelmingly boys, 15, 16, some even younger, some women, and large numbers of older men in their 50s and 60s. These people have almost no training, perhaps 2, 3, 4 weeks of familiarity with weapons and so forth, and they're being hurled into the breach. Now, Ukraine still has a few so-called elite formations left that they've been holding in reserve, and I'm told now they're starting to funnel them as a last-ditch effort into what remains of Bakhmut. But the bottom line is the Ukrainians are now scraping the bottom of the barrel for people. In addition to those, you've got about 35,000, maybe a little bit more, Ukrainian soldiers officers training in Western countries that will eventually come back. They're supposed to have the training that's necessary to operate the more sophisticated equipment. Because right now, anything like rocket artillery and various radars, some of the logistics and the distribution system, the higher staffs, those are populated by NATO military manpower. And without that NATO military manpower, American, German, whatever, in Ukrainian uniform or simply unidentifiable uniforms, I think the whole effort would fall apart. So, it's a tragic situation. Ukraine cannot win. Well, Doug, you know the New York Times says that they want to give the Ukrainians long-range enough rockets and permission to use them to hit Russian targets on Crimea in order to let the Russians know that their rear is not safe and we could reach out and touch them whenever we want. And that will put the Ukrainians. I'm defining we broadly to include the American Empire, Ukraine together, and us little old Texans dragged along with them. The Ukrainians will then be in such a position of strength that they'll be able to negotiate well with Russia. Well, you know that's delusional. We started out by saying that they had thousands of Javelin missiles, and this was a game changer that would turn defeat into victory. The Russians figured out how to counter those and captured large numbers of them. I could go down the list of all the various weapon systems that have shown up that have not been a game changer. Historically, we know that no one silver bullet weapon system dramatically changes the battlefield. It's never just about the individual weapon, it's always about how you integrate it within a broader framework. Right now, the key thing that we're pushing, as you know, are F-16s, and we're currently training 2 Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s. My concern is that it will become increasingly obvious that the pilots will have to be, once again, contractors, NATO military manpower in contractor garb, to fly them. Secondly, I would expect them to be shot down by the very thick and effective Russian air defenses. The Russian air and missile defenses are quite good. They've managed to massively reduce the numbers of rockets and missiles that get through, effectively erasing the Ukrainian Air Force, what there is of it, from the sky because if they fly, they die. I think that will happen to us as well, so I hope we don't do that. But if we do, and we have even modest success, it's like everything else, no one can protect anything perfectly. So, if there is any penetration at all, the Russians may conclude that they might as well go ahead and attack our rear areas, and that means Poland and probably Lithuania, at least insofar as it includes facilities that are stockpiling weapons and equipment and training Ukrainian forces. But again, the Russians thus far have exhibited tremendous restraint, principally because they don't want a war with Europe, they don't want a war with us, and I'm not sure they need to do that to win. But we ought to understand that if you do certain things and you think you can do it with impunity, you're nearly always wrong. There are other ways for your opponent to respond, and things are not good in NATO. NATO is deeply divided. Behind the scenes, people are very unhappy with what's happened. Many people think they've been betrayed by us because we've led them down this garden path. We promised them Ukrainian victory, and they know that's never going to happen, and they now have in front of them something they haven't seen for 30 years, which is an enormous and powerful Russian army and air force because Putin and his friends have built, in a very short period of time, this enormous force, which they plan to increase to 1.5 million. Right now, it's over 800,000, and focused on Ukraine, 600 to 700,000. So, I think the Europeans want to put an end to this, they just haven't figured out how to do it without upsetting their relationship with us. Yeah, well, and it's funny because a year ago, you told me, well, our hope lies with the Germans, that they will put their foot down and say this is just too much chaos in Europe, we can't have this. That was what led to Minsk 1 and 2 back in 14 and 15, and right, it hadn't been enough pressure on them yet, which is just amazing. I guess they've been subsidizing everybody's energy costs, right, and helping to relieve that political pressure, but that's a stopgap measure, right? They've got to print that money or borrow it from somebody to pay for all that. Well, I think that's true, except that I would point out that Schultz, at least if you look at the polls in Germany, is in real trouble. There's almost an overwhelming majority, I'm talking about 78% of the population, that thinks that his foreign minister, this Annalena Baerbock, should be removed. She's sort of the Americanized German who runs around wagging her finger and fist at the Russians for being bad, for not respecting whatever she thinks is appropriate and deserving. She's the one that announced that Europe and Germany were at war with Russia, which deeply troubled and upset the German population, which has absolutely no interest in being at war with anybody. So, I think she's going to go, and I think Schultz is going to have a tough time surviving. Now, when does the no-confidence vote come, under what circumstances, who knows, but I think it's inevitable. I don't think Mr. Macron is on particularly strong ground either, but his presidency is a little bit more robust than Chancellor Schultz's position, and you see London is chaos. So, the bottom line is, I think something will give in Europe, and when it does and when things crack, we're going to see the edifice collapse rather dramatically. At which point in time, the question is, what do we do? Because we brought this on, remember, the Biden administration insisted over and over and over again that they were going to strengthen NATO, they were going to build it up, and now NATO is stronger than ever. Well, all you have to do is look at the promises made to deliver equipment and what actually showed up, and it's very weak. That was a message that Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, delivered at his last meeting with the various NATO allies and other partners, asking for equipment, and he gets a promise of 3 tanks from Portugal, he gets a promise of X number of tanks from Germany, and thus far, nothing's shown up. Now we're being told that if the German tanks do show up, they're probably going to have to be manned by Germans and Poles and others because the Ukrainians can't be trained up to do it. In fact, just yesterday, we received reports that a German Leopard tank was already captured in the vicinity of Bmat, and it was manned entirely by Polish soldiers. So the Polish soldiers were captured along with a tank. We'll see what that looks like when the media gets a hold of it and we get pictures. Well, and all right, so presuming the Ukrainian military is at some point just exhausted, as you're talking about that article you sent today. In fact, let me refer the readers to that so we make sure it's in the show notes and everything too. It's at the Kyiv Independent, it's KyivIndependent.com. Ukrainian soldiers in __, our troops are not being protected. And yeah, He says, if you go to the front, you've got a 30 to 70 chance that you'll make it back at all. These people are being killed and, of course, blown to pieces, right, by artillery shells is what most of the fighting is. It's just an absolute horror show going on over there, and this article is a really in-depth thing. The guy spent at least a few days at the front here interviewing different guys. Remember, Scott, that is a Ukrainian newspaper, yes, and clearly a very pro-regime one. Yeah, it's not pro-Russian, it's just telling you the truth, right? Yeah, and it's, you got to figure maybe some of the worst is left out, but what remains is really bad. And they're talking about the other thing to keep in mind is the Ukrainians have already fired 1 million artillery shells. That doesn't include their use of drones and rockets and so forth, and now they're effectively running out. One of the points that the author of that article makes is that in most cases, they're getting no artillery support at all from their own side, and the artillery they have is literally from World War II. Yes, yeah, and I mean the problem is everyone who looked at this war from the beginning is getting an education because just about everybody underestimated the amount of ammunition and the losses that would be taken. And people overestimated the effect of many weapons. And many of the weapons that we produced, we thought would be superstar performers, both German and American, didn't turn out to be that way. So everybody got something wrong on this. But right now, the people suffering are the Ukrainians, and the real question is, what's next? I think next is collapse, and the question is, what do we do when this becomes clear? What do we do when the Russians break out and simply overrun all of eastern Ukraine? Are we going to go into this ourselves? Which is my great nightmare. But Doug, aren't we? Well, let me get back to that in just 1 second because I have that in the notes. I'll put an asterisk so I don't forget. But go back 1 year. I think we're fighting Plan B right now, because Plan A, I was just reading one this morning from the Washington Post from last March that, the Ukrainians have done pretty good in blunting the Russians' advance. But everyone here in D.C. and at the Pentagon expects that Kyiv will fall within a few weeks or so, and then we'll go back to Plan A, which was backing an insurgency, as they talked about in December 21 and January and February 22. And I don't know, 15 different press releases and statements here and there that were going to replicate Afghanistan just a few months after finally losing Afghanistan themselves. After, supposedly taming the blowback from the last time they did this to the Russians in Afghanistan, they said, this is the model, this is what we're going to do. We're going to give them javelins and all this, but we're going to be backing essentially the ATO battalion because the Ukrainian military they expected to be completely smashed within the first month or so. So, I wonder if that's the answer that, when and if at some point the structure of the Ukrainian state and its military forces east of the river finally are just broken, then that's fine. Then they just go right back to hiring Right Sector and C-14 and Azov to go do, I don't know, suicide attacks, moderate rebel antics, stuff like that.